Everyone, a warm welcome to everybody here on behalf of CASAC and Parry to this conference looking at the report and recommendations of the State Capture Commission of Inquiry, and a warm welcome to those joining us online as well. My name is Lawson Naidu. I'm the Executive Secretary of CASAC, as I said, one of the co-hosts of this conference. I think your presence here is testament to the fact that this is an important occasion in the trajectory of our country and dealing with corruption and state capture. The Commission of Inquiry lasted for almost 4.5 years. It was gazetted in January of 2018, and as we know, produced its final report in June of this year, just a couple of months ago. I think it's fair to say that the reports, the compendium of reports, as I like to call them, are an important body of work that deepens our understanding of the phenomenon of state capture and how that unfolded in South Africa. In an address a couple of weeks ago at an event in Sandton, the Chief Justice delivered a keynote address. And I want to refer to some of what he said then. And he said that amongst the questions that the State Capture Commission had to determine were the following 5 issues. Firstly, was there state capture? Secondly, if there was, how did it come about? Thirdly, who were the perpetrators and the key role players? Fourthly, what measures should be put in place to ensure that we never again are subjected to state capture? And then finally, what conditions may have existed to provide the fertile ground for state capture to take root? We're going to focus on some of those questions in our discussions over the next 2 days, and primarily the last 2. Looking at the institutional weaknesses and the institutional recommendations that will help strengthen our democracy in the future. We're not going to focus on the issues about the perpetrators and the role players. I think we'll leave that to the law enforcement agencies to deal with. So we're going to focus on particular aspects of the report and its recommendations, and you'll see from the program the specific and distinct areas that we have chosen to focus on: the role of the private sector, public procurement reform, personnel practices in public administration, institutions to fight corruption, what whistleblower protection and support is required, and then the role of Parliament, and then ending up looking at how do we implement these recommendations. We have a series of recommendations in these reports from the State Capture Commission. And I think it's time now, and what we've sought to do is to gather in this room and online the subject matter specialists and experts who now need to come to the fore to critique, to sharpen, and to refine the proposals and recommendations that are there. Because I think as much as the work that was done by the State Capture Commission, its recommendations require these subject matter experts, and many of you are here in the room and online to help us to do that. We therefore need to use the report as a basis for understanding what went wrong, where are the weaknesses in our system of constitutional democracy, and how we can strengthen them. We know that next month, the President will report to Parliament on his plan of action with regards to the report and specifically its recommendations. We must begin to craft a set of proposals and interventions that will ensure that there's effective implementation of some of those recommendations. So this conference is really the start of a process. It's not going to be a one-off event. It's starting the engagement about What do those recommendations mean? How can we implement them in practice? And what sort of levers of pressure are required to ensure that that does actually happen? In this context, civil society has a critical role to play as the conscience of the nation. We were the front line of defense together with the media when institutions of governance and organs of state colluded to undermine accountability, to protect the perpetrators, and to allow a culture of impunity to prevail. We now need to close that accountability deficit, which I think is one of the key threads that permeates the reports of the State Capture Commission. The question that is sometimes asked is, was it worth 1 billion rands? And maybe Terence is going to help us to answer that question. But let me venture to suggest that maybe it is too early to say. It will not be worth it if we allow the report to gather dust as we have done on so many previous occasions with so many other reports of similar inquiries. It's a national malaise that we are very good at diagnosing problems, but not so good at actually implementing and fixing them. It needs to be and must be different this time. It will be worth it. It will be worth that billion rands if we collectively say, and to paraphrase Madiba, never, never, and never again. So welcome to this conference. I hope you're going to contribute deeply to the conversations that are going to happen over the next 2 days. And let me now hand over to Lindiwe. Thank you.
Thank you, Lawson. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lindiwe Ndlela, and I am the head of programs at PARI, and I'm very, very pleased to be here today with you all. You might be curious about this duck that I have here, but I'll tell you all about it just now. My job, I think, in these 2 days is to basically be the one who tells you where everything is. I'm your points person, and I might actually, if you come to me, I might point you to 10 different other people who might be helping you. So I'm here to take you through the program. Lawson has actually welcomed us, and as you will have you do have the program in your packs. We will have breaks. We are aiming to have our first comfort break at 10:45 before we take our first panel. And lunch is scheduled for 12:30. We will try as much as possible to keep to the end time so that we don't keep it here. So there might be shifts here and there, small tweaks. The second panel, which will be looking at public procurement, will happen after lunch. And the final panel for today will happen at 3 o'clock, and that panel will be focusing on personnel practices in the public administration. But I'm obviously here today, I'm here to also introduce you to our keynote address. You will know that COVID protocols have been relaxed now, but it doesn't mean that COVID has simply gone away. It's still with us. So if you feel you need to put your mask on, we will not judge you. We will actually respect you for protecting us. So please, let's still be careful about how we conduct ourselves. I see, even I hugged a few people today. But I'm packed with vitamin C and all the other things that I need to take to prevent, to protect myself and prevent COVID. So I'm going to introduce you to Duckworth Lewis. I'm told Duckworth Lewis is related to everybody whose last name is Lewis here today and everywhere else in the world. And Duckworth Lewis has traveled the world to help with facilitation. So if you've got nerves, like I'm feeling some nerves today, Duckworth Lewis is there for you. So I'll keep Duckworth Lewis here. She belongs to Kirsten Pearson somewhere. Where's Kirsten? She belongs to Kirsten, or he belongs to Kirsten. I'm deciding to rename, to just kind of like assign a different gender to Duckworth Lewis. Apparently, Duckworth Lewis is one, there's a Duckworth Lewis system that gets used in cricket. So if it rains, they apply the Duckworth-Lewis system to cancel. So you'll forgive me if the facts are not so straight. But today it's not raining, Kirsten. So I guess Duckworth-Lewis is just really here to keep us calm. But really, truly here today, I'm also meant to introduce you to our keynote speaker, who has gladly said to me, I can exaggerate as much as possible in terms of what he has achieved. Our keynote address is going to be given by Mr. Terence Nombembe, who was the head of investigations at the Commission of Inquiry into State Capture. He was also the former, I think most of us know him as the former AG, Auditor General, and some of us who've kind of like fresh from government, we know just how the AG does it, right? He is the former Auditor General of South Africa. He did the stint between 2006 and 2013. And there he developed a strong reputation of integrity and enhanced the public visibility of the AG. You know, I think I wish he had stayed because the AG is behaving very badly sometimes these days. He was also the CEO of SAICA, which is the South African Institute of Chartered Accountants. He's currently the chair of the Gauteng Ethics Advisory Council and serves as a board member of the South African Reserve Bank. Terence studied at the University of Transkei, where he completed his Bachelor of Commerce degree, and also at the University of South Africa, where he completed the honors in Bachelor of Accounting, commonly known as Bachelor of Accounting Science, commonly known as BComt honors. He was conferred with an honorary doctorate in accounting science by the Walter Sisulu University in 2014. So without any waste of time, can I invite you to come forward, Mr. Terence Nombembe, and we look forward to your address. I don't know if you want Duckworth-Lewis.
The time.
No, it's not a timer. Whoever wants it.
Thanks very much, Kianakoli Program Director. Ladies and gentlemen in the room and in the virtual platforms, may I also express a word of sincere thanks to Pari and KSAC for this opportunity to be part of this occasion. My comments will be somewhat diluted by the multiple roles that my introduction has alluded to. The things that I tend to see as part of the Gauteng Ethics Advisory platform. The things that I saw as the Auditor General close to 10 years ago. The things that I saw as part of the head of the accounting profession at SAICA. And lastly, the thing that I did and saw as part of what you invited me to come and speak to this conference about at the State Capture Commission. But let me start off by perhaps finding a theme for this message that I want to briefly share with yourselves. And I would characterize that theme as, I think, coming from Lawson's opening remarks, as the credible outcome and the baseline for the reversal of the state capture tide. And I thought about this when I penned down a few comments and observations I had, that whatever it is that may have been done in the last close to 5 years, close to what Lawson calls 1 billion, I'm not quite sure what a 1 billion is, at the end of the day, we've got material that serves as a credible outcome and a credible baseline for us to march forward, to make sure that what Chief Justice would have said in that gathering that Lawson was referring to, we ought not to, unless we want to, have another experience that we have experienced in the past 5 years in terms of the testimonies, and obviously more than 10 years in terms of the actual execution of those unfortunate experiences of state capture. So that's basically the reason for this theme basically dropping from my head and anchoring this short message to you around it. If you don't agree with me, you're happy not to agree with me, but that's the position that I hold, having been part of the process that listened to and participated in the 5 years of noble privilege and hard work that this country has been able to go through. So I thought of sharing my experiences in 3 parts, basically. And I'll introduce each part as I go along. The first one, we cannot underestimate, and I want to acknowledge the work and the relationship that the coalition of civil society organizations did and participated so actively in working with the commission. There are many instances where there had to be good and well coordinated engagement with civil society organizations that were in the form of a coalition. It started with the meeting that was held to introduce the interest that the civil society organizations had, and them expressing the fact that they actually organized in a much more better setup that will make the work of engagement with the commission much more easier and much more smooth, which is what was encouraged, which is what was embraced. That gave us an opportunity to have a very clear focal point in terms of who gets contacted from the commission side, who gets contacted from the coalition of civil society organizations. You will excuse me, I'm not going to be dropping names because I guess I still have the commission obsession of doing things and saying things without mentioning names. So collectively and individually, civil society organizations did make submissions to the State Capture Commission, which were very helpful and very useful in it being able to do its work. And that, I think, is worth appreciating. And this, once again, being a civil society-led kind of forum or conference, bears testimony to the need and importance of continuing with that kind of exercise. There were expert skills that were critical in supporting the work of the commission that the civil society organizations provided, both in the form of the team that worked within the commission. Once again, I'm not going to mention which one and who, but I think it's good to know that the civil society organizations were great in terms of taking an interest in making sure that the necessary and the required skills are made available. Also, in the form of the testimonies that had to be, and witness accounts that needed to be provided. Civil society organizations volunteered their heads, volunteered their people to actually do that, which made the work of the commission to be what it is today, to actually hear and understand that work. So one cannot underestimate those expert witnesses, which I want to singularly highlight, that made the work of the civil society organization and the commission to actually get to where it was. Lastly, there were moments where these forums, I think we had about 2 of them, if I count well. There were not too many because it was important that the commission doesn't get perceived as being influenced by the civil society organization, because it was highly, highly objective and independent. But the importance of comparing notes, which, by the way, the chairman of the commission was kept abreast of those sessions. As I said, there was only 2 of them. Those platforms to actually reassure one another, because I must say the Coalition of Civil Society Organizations had lots of questions. And it was important not to avoid those questions, but to respond to them and confront them. And I hope our responses were actually satisfactory, because they were reassuring mutually, I must say, in terms of what the feeling on the ground is. I mean, there were times when we had to disagree on, let me start with what we agreed upon. Agreed about the destination that everyone has got to get to. And the beauty with that is that that destination was defined in the terms of reference of the commission. So there was no argument about where the destination was. But where we sometimes disagreed was the route towards that destination. And in my next comment, you will understand why there were differences of preferences in terms of the route that gets taken. Because there were certain pressures, there were certain realities that we saw, which from outside the commission, the civil society organization may not necessarily have been privy to. But bottom line is that destination was common. So I just thought, let me not skimp on the reference to and the appreciation of the general work of an interest that is this community of civil society organizations had played throughout, and I hope going forward you continue, and this conference being one of the platforms and processes to continue to express yourselves in the interest of what we call the public interest. Right. Secondly, the issue of I call it here the foundational pillars within the commission that kept the commission and its teams sane and kept the commission and its teams going. What were those foundational pillars, which culminated in what you may have seen in the public hearings, which also culminated in what you would have seen in the voluminous reports. But there was a lot that was happening behind the scenes, which without being too graphic about it, I'll just share some anecdotes, most of which we'd have experienced anyway in the public space. One cannot underestimate or downplay something that is very obvious in terms of how the commission operated. The prescripts that basically regulated everything that the commission had to do. Whether you call it terms of reference, whether you call it the regulations, whether you call it the rules, and even the powers that the commission had to be able to do its work. Those are fundamentally important to be absolutely unambiguous in order to make sure that there is consistency in the manner in which the commission operated. And not only consistency, but there was also fairness in the way in which the core team that used those prescripts, being the investigators, being the legal team, being the secretariat, and above all, the chairman, were actually operating those with a great degree of, can I call it grace and courtesy, a great degree of humility, great degree of respect, and a great degree of assertiveness when that assertiveness was actually required. But everything had that reference point, and it was very important that that become a rule book and a reference point against which every decision, every pronouncement, every call had to be made by all those core pillars of the commission. Secondly, the positive influence of the chairman himself. People outside the commission may have seen him only in the public space, but the way he would have been operating within the commission, providing a lot of clear leadership, clarity of expectations. And I want to touch on this clarity of expectations because if you look at the way the commission worked, it was not working in the form of a traditional approach. And I think the chairman did allude to that in one of the public platforms that he commented on, that it would have been most ideal for all the work to be done. And once all the work has been done, then the hearings start. The commission did not work that way. It worked every day, every hour in the public glare. And that alone meant that the clarity of expectation of the chairman, which I'm so grateful to have been part of that privilege, was so important and inspirational. His work ethic, I think the public have seen him going through bulky bundles, going through oral evidence over extended and excessive hours, sometimes over the public holidays, after hours, etc., etc. That makes the people that are actually feeding into that process to be equally inspired and supportive of that process. It's something that just could not be taken for granted. The humility with which he conducted himself, respect, the fairness, and the assertiveness that he had to also display towards the stakeholders, and all that in strict application of the prescripts that the commission was working under and with, including his own experience in law, his own experience in the craft that he's actually involved in, which is basically the judiciary. So all those combined went a long way in making sure that that leadership that was needed to clarify the expectations, to chart the direction of a very, how can I call it, a very fluid kind of process, because it was never smooth. It was very fluid, made it possible for the operators that were working and the professionals that were working to actually then organize themselves to move with agility around that kind of process. So that brings me to the working method of the commission, which maybe if you're outside of it, you may find it rather frustrating, cumbersome, or unusual. But the bottom line is that the continuous public visibility of the process of the commission, as I've said earlier, was very, very important to bear in mind. Because everything you do, everything you say was in the public glare. And therefore, we have had, as the operators, we have had as a team to make sure that we are very agile, so that when things change overnight, we're able to actually fit with that change without dropping a ball. So the agility of the delivery team, and as I've said, working in a less traditional, tried and tested method was something that was a hallmark of the success of this process. Because without that agility, there would have been multiple conflicts there would have been multiple delays, there would have been multiple unnecessary arguments. But it was very important that as the delivery team, we work in such a manner that would make sure that we are flexible, over and above being agile, to align to the chairman's priorities. That was what was important. And that's why it was important for the clarity of the leadership and the direction and the priorities of the chairman needed to be another success factor. Most of us in the commission were professionals that are used to working around these tried and tested methods. Now, when things basically are so fluid, it's easy to actually drop the ball on professionalism. It's easy to have an excuse to say, I could not adhere to the code of conduct of my profession because things are not predictable. They're so ambiguous. But we made a point that regardless of those fluid and unpredictable patterns of public movements, professionalism and the code of conduct just could not be compromised by the team, delivery team. We just couldn't do that. We just couldn't dare think about that and make an excuse. Because that public nature of the way the commission worked was such that if those were to be compromised, if those were to be taken for granted, it would be glaring publicly. It's not something that will pick up after the effect. It will actually reveal itself instantly. So that was one of the values that we have had to respect and adhere to. The culture of teamwork, I must also mention that as the fourth issue, had to be perfected. It had to be perfected, especially given the importance of the process and the compliance to the prescripts that I mentioned earlier. That may take for granted, but when the Secretariat team has got to issue those bundles, when the Secretariat has got to issue those Rule 33 notices, and everything to make sure that full fairness is observed, it had to work with the legal team. It had to work with the investigators to make sure that everything works in a kind of a properly synchronized fashion, you know. And I'm talking here about volumes and volumes of things that had to be done. So teamwork was absolutely, absolutely critical. And this is teamwork of people that are so diverse. I mean, work with advocates, I mean, they basically work solo. They're not used to work with anyone. But in this process, that had to be, and I take my hat off, I mean, those teams. You know, I had to work with them, civil servants, I mean, bureaucrats, you know. But we had to work with investigators, I mean, accountants, you name it. So many different, a fruit salad basically of people brought together. But the issue of teamwork had to be coordinated by the head of investigation, the head of the legal team, and the secretary to make sure that nothing falls between the cracks, because if that happens, something will give. And also, I must mention this, that the issue of integrity and ethical culture is something also that just could not be taken for granted or compromised. It had to be the inherent cornerstone of the entire delivery team. Because you can imagine the team that is dealing with issues of this sensitivity that the commission was tasked in terms of systems of reference to deal with. And one of its members is actually fingered for exactly the same conduct that the commission is actually entrusted to deal with. So these are the obvious things that we've had to make sure that they actually are embedded and inherent in the way and we operate and the outlook of the delivery team. Lawson talks about 1 billion, as I said, I'm not sure what it means, but the administrative excellence, the program management excellence have had to be part of the hallmark of this process. Because we have had to, even though, the Department of Justice was in charge of the funding that the commission needed, but we have had to be able to account for each and every cent. We would have easily relegated that to the Department of Justice and say, you provide the money, you account for it. But we couldn't do that. The legal team had to do that. The investigation team had to do that. The secretariat had to do that. So that when these figures are bandied around, we're actually less phased about them because we know what they were actually directed towards and can be motivated and justified when the time is right to do that. Whether that's what South Africa wants to debate these days, we don't know. But if you want the answers, we've got the answers, But that's not the issue. The issue is the issue is about the bigger picture of what the commission was subjected to and made to deliver. That's the important issue. So the quality that underpins that 1 billion was something that was so critical, so that we can speak with confidence without any reservations or fear of contradiction when we actually speak about that. So that's how at ease we are. That's how comfortable we are about whatever it is that was administratively had to be managed and program managed around this project. And lastly, the issue of public interest, could not be taken for granted. That focus on public interest happened even in the face of hardship that was characterized by the heavy workloads, the complex matters that were dealt with, tight deadlines, and even funding constraints at times. Working, I think the judge has said this so many times, without being paid for the longest of time. But no one actually thought of actually putting tools down and said, I've not been paid for 5 months or 6 months. The work and the show just went on. That to me is an issue of serious public interest. All right, so enough for the sideshow. Now, I think you called me here to comment on some anecdotes around the report. Briefly, I would characterize this report. It's quite a large report. It's quite a long report into 2 parts. That's basically how I would characterize it. Someone else may have a different view of how to characterize it. There are those things that were transactional, those things that were visible, those things that were, how can I call them, the tip of the iceberg, what we could see. And the bulk of the report did cover quite at length issues of what happened, when it happened, how it happened, where it happened, who was involved, how much was involved, how often did things happen, with whom. We can go on and on and on with these situations. And that's basically where the bulk of the report seems to be centered around. And it's important because all those things were part of the terms of reference and they could not be skipped. The report does cover quite extensively a lot of shortcomings, a lot of ineffectiveness, inefficiencies, incapacity, breaches, and everything that went south or went wrong insofar as the process that should have prevented state capture was concerned. Whether that was as a result of maybe the lapse or the misinterpretation or lack of clear legislative frameworks, that's debatable. I mean, given the fact that South Africa's got a lot of laws, regulatory frameworks, were they clear, were they sidestepped, operational effectiveness and efficiencies, the assurance process by the assurance providers, as well as oversight itself, whether it's by Parliament or by the boards or whoever is entrusted with exercising oversight over preventing those things that happened not to have happened. But there's a litany of information about those shortcomings, inefficiencies, ineffectiveness, incapacity, breaches, etc., etc. The report is quite expressive on that, and you have all gone through those reports from cover to cover. And above all, this report is enriched with countless recommendations that respond to what are called these visible, transactional, factual matters, indisputable matters of wrongdoing and self-interest or self-enrichment. That's basically the tone fundamentally of what is covered in the report. Once again, terms of references demanded that that be the case, and therefore that had to be respected. There's no denying the fact that many of these recommendations still require further work, especially further investigative work, particularly by the law enforcement agencies. I'm sure you may have wondered why now refer things to law enforcement for further work and further investigations when the commission said for 5 years. This room is full of lawyers. You know that the commission basically works on the balance of probability, whereas law enforcement agencies work on something more than that, something that can be proven beyond reasonable doubt. So that's why further work needs to be done. But the beauty of this is this, that the amended Regulation 11 of the Commission, if you haven't read it, please go to the website of the Commission and read that Section 11 amendment. Is so empowering in terms of providing an enabling environment for the effective and smooth coordination and collaboration between the Commission and the law enforcement agencies. So there can never be a situation where law enforcement agencies say, we don't know where to look. We don't have the resources to look where we're supposed to look. Amended Section 11, please go and read it. It's so empowering. It happened at the instance of a lot of requests by law enforcement agencies for this to happen, and it did eventually happen during the life, I think halfway through the life of the Commission. And therefore, whether it was during the life of the Commission or even after the life of the Commission, there has got to be some form of a clear position to make sure that that empowering arrangement is actually put into effect, to actually be able to speed up the work that needs to be further done by law enforcement agencies. The only thing that is regrettable, I must say, of those that were picked up, those that were visible, is that as we speak today, my view, I may not here be speaking now from the Commission's perspective or what you asked me to come and speak about here, is that the things that were found in the Commission are still happening as we speak today. The things that we found in the commission are still happening in even a much worse situation than we may have had in the public space in the commission. Issues of maladministration, issues of self-enrichment are still happening as we speak today. And they're happening, sadly, in what the commission could not get to the bottom of, which is terms of reference 1.5 and 1.9. Those terms of reference are mainly about looking at the nature and extent of fraud and corruption, primarily 1.5 in the SOEs, the big ones, and the rest of government in terms of reference 1.9. That's why it is absolutely and vitally important that those that have not had the opportunity to witness, to become witnesses or be called to the commission, I believe they don't have a leg to stand on to say, because we've not been part of the commission, therefore we can be considered to be immune. Some of them are the worst perpetrators of the things that we found in the commission, in the provinces, in municipalities, in state-owned entities that may not have come before the commission, because the commission only dealt with about 4 or 5. There's hundreds of SOEs from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, if not 4. These things are happening with the same rigor, with the same level of intensity as they were happening in those that people have actually witnessed in the commission. That's where our challenge is. And if I recall what the judge said in one of his public comments, he may have said this in the report as well, that and these levels of corruption and state capture have actually reached, he actually starts by saying there's no denying the fact that these levels of corruption and state capture have reached proportions that are unacceptably high. That's a given. And I think it's a question of saying to ourselves, is that the given that we're prepared to live with as South Africans? And I would imagine a conference like this needs to seize itself with responding to that reality, that we're not out of the woods as yet. In spite of the fact that we do have a baseline that is credible enough to make sure that we can turn the tide. The second and last issue I want to comment on the anecdotes around the report, are those things that I call them the root causes. Those things that I would call are happening beneath the surface. Those things that are behavioral by nature. Those things that you would struggle to know, what is the psyche of the person who actually, even at face value, comes across as respectable? How could he or she, or institutions that are respectable at face value, be involved in matters and transactions similar to those that I've mentioned before and mentioned in the bulk of the report of the Commission? I come to the conclusion that the primary cause of all this is greed, and I don't think we should be apologetic about that. Greed is what is actually consuming and imploding our ability to have a decent state in South Africa. And I don't think we should be shy about that. I don't think we should actually be walking on eggs in actual talk about that. I think we should be very direct. Unless we can get rid of greed, we will not be able to reverse the tide. That's the animal. That's the enemy we have got to defeat. The dictionary definition of greed is an intense and selfish desire It's a selfish desire for something. It's so simple. Whether it's wealth, whether it's power, sometimes it can be food. But in the context of state capture, people are not looking for food. People are looking for wealth and power as a result of greed. This greed has given rise to something so unusual. You know, when we were at school, doing accounting, auditing 101, whatever the course was, Kaya here is a lecturer, so he would know where to find this in the books. They would tell us that if you want a situation where internal controls can be overridden, management must override those controls. If management override the controls, then it's going to be very difficult to pick up the problem because they're expected to be the custodians of good order. Now, in South Africa, we had something more serious and more damaging than that. We have got leadership that are supposed to be overseeing management, themselves overriding the controls. So if managers override controls and cannot even be seen by leaders or assurance providers, how much more if the leaders that are right on top become part of the process of overriding controls? And I've got a funny terminology that I used on this, is that it's actually internal control override on overdrive. This thing was on steroids. It was just unstoppable. And therefore, it was basically free for all. The gates were just wide open for anything to happen that was wrong. If you could think of anything that could go wrong, it would go wrong because it was override on overdrive by the leaders that are supposed to be the custodians of good order, or stewards of good order, if I can put it that way. And only because of this intense and selfish desire to cling to power and cling to wealth. The other issue, the breach of the code of professional conduct by the professionals that were in leadership positions, that were in the assurance roles, that were within the civil service and even law enforcement agencies. The same thing happened. That breach of professionalism and the code of conduct by the professionals that were also in business and entrusted with advisory, entrusted with consulting, entrusted with other forms of leadership. So it's basically breach of a breach of a breach by everyone that is supposed to be a trusted player in the system. All because of greed. Not to mention the excessive use of cash and other means to actually make sure that people can look the other way, or through bribes and kickbacks. This one is worse. Excessive use of harmful means to victimize those that mean good and expose the wrongdoing. Whether it's by elimination or denial of opportunities for livelihood, and anything else associated with that, that makes sure that harm is inflicted on those that mean good. All because of what? Greed. That's why I'm emphasizing this issue of greed, because with that, my question to this gathering is, and which we need to ponder about. How, therefore, do we uproot such horrific conduct? How do we? Horrific conduct that disrupts the livelihood of South Africans to a point of self-infliction and destruction. Are these the things that we can actually legislate against? I mean, this kind of phenomenon, can we have policy positions or developments to respond to them and reverse them? How possible is it to find and choose visibly courageous leaders that can talk, and not only talk, but walk the talk on issues of morality, issues of being morally correct and justified, what is called in other disciplines righteousness, justice, love, kindness, and selflessness, and even self-control. The same applies to being able to find professionals that can, in fact, align themselves to this notion of doing things that are good all the time. And here is my other question. In this situation, and it's going to continue, there are a lot of people that are sitting on the fence. Are we able to actually reach out and inspire those fence sitters so that they're also visibly courageous and vocal about walking the talk of goodness, doing the right things all the time? As if that's not enough. Those that are greedy, to what extent are we able, as South Africans, to extend a hand, inspire them to be able to feel remorseful? In other industries, it's called repentance. But unless we do that, the thing that I said earlier, that as we speak today, the things that you saw happening, playing themselves in the movie, are happening even with greater intensity than what we may have seen in the State Capture Commission. And unless we reach out to those that are part of the process and make sure that we are inspirational enough to be able to win them over. Can a process like this, policymakers, legislators, be able to legislate around those issues? We cannot exclude households here. We cannot exclude organizations, institutions that instill the sense of goodness in how people operate. Because if we do that, then we're actually skirting around the surface. We're not dealing with the serious issue of greed. So you may ask, so what does it have to do with the commission? What does this have to do with the report of the commission? I do believe that these issues, the chairman did apply his mind to it because he was really concerned about how is it possible to actually stop these things from ever happening again? And where it's happening, it can actually be minimized. Because there are three things that it's not a lot of information in the reports, but if one looks at the 80-20 principle, it may be 20% of the comments in the report that address 80% of the problems that we have. But the reality with this is that none of them have been matured enough, formalized enough, and thought through enough It's basically things to ponder about and make sure that they can be implemented and implementable. If one looks at the, it was interesting to actually read the public comments about the procurement report that came with rather unusual and strange propositions about how procurement needs to be transfigured in order for it to actually have the effect of turning the tide. There's no denying there that the issue of political will to want to implement that procurement unusual kind of stance, unless there's political will, there'll be a reason to say, this thing is actually not practical. This thing is actually not real. It is difficult to implement. It doesn't take cognizance of the reality. It doesn't take cognizance of the fact that Treasury has got an established procurement unit and processes that are there. But this report goes beyond that. It's cutting to the chase of the things that at the belly of this iceberg, or at the belly of the beast, if I can put it that way. To say, how do we start to deal with greed under difficult and unpredictable circumstances? And unless there is that political will to do that, it's never going to happen. It's going to be business as usual. So this report also makes reference to mass mobilization of citizenry to rally behind proper practices when it comes to this biggest attraction for wealth when it comes to procurement in the state. It calls for transparency, because anything that happens in the dark is bound to actually go astray and continue in the dark. So transparency, digitization, and everything that will make sure that everything is happening in the glare and in the open is important. It may be simple things, but they work if they're done with the right political will. The continuity of the fair public process that people have been able to experience during the commission, so that when someone does something wrong, it's known in South Africa that there is a process where they will come to a tribunal or whatever the thing is called to actually answer certain questions. Whether that will make people uncomfortable or comfortable, for what it's worth, is one of the menu of things. It's not the only one. The professionalization of the procurement industry, which deals with the bulk of the government wealth that was captured, yet is actually not even professionalized. So it's calling for that. The safe and effective reporting or disclosure or whistleblowing kind of platforms or houses or whatever I want to call. Most of these things are not in place as we speak. The one reference that this report makes is an example that this has proven to actually work quite well, even though it may not be in the same form in the Competition Commission. So it's drawing from that experience and say, but this works well there. It's happening without being hugely publicized, but it's very effective. Why don't you actually institutionalize it in the place where government has got the biggest challenge? So it's not taking something that is coming out of the sky. It's taking something that works, tried and tested. But it needs the will, it needs to be directed, it needs to be done properly. The issue of professionalizing the civil service. You have arrived, sir. And instilling the culture of integrity is vitally, vitally important. You've heard during the president's testimony, he made reference to that a lot. The question we need to ask ourselves, how mature is that process? How much political will is there behind that process? Not the talk, but the will. How visionary And authentic is the leadership that is supposed to roll out that ideal. This even goes to the independent process of appointing key people in key positions, whether it's state-owned entities, I think the report makes reference to that, whether it's key state institutions like, let's say, Chapter 9 institutions, law enforcement agencies, you name it, the boards of state-owned entities. But for me, this is something that as leaders, we tend to look at quite seriously. Is there a clear roadmap of how this thing will evolve? Or is it just happening haphazardly? People just keep going to training and hope for the best. Do we have a clear roadmap, practical roadmap, with clear milestones that by such and such a year, we will be able to achieve and see a civil service that looks like this? Anticipate what is to be and what should be, and work towards that without ceasing, And even define the levels of maturity that public service will actually display, so that it's not left to chance. And people are actually then incentivized around the achievement of those clearly defined milestones, To the extent that corrective measures and consequences need to be considered, there must be that as well. So do we have that as part of managing the rollout of professionalizing the public service, or is it just speech, or speak, or rhetoric, whatever I want to call it? Here's something else that's important. Anything that has got a legacy that is deeply entrenched, which we're dealing with here in terms of the civil service, has got to have what is called a step or a booster dose. Do we have a booster dose to actually professionalize the civil service? Because if you don't have it, it will never work. We can put all the energy to it, and it will never work. So we need to have a clear step dose or booster dose. I guess the people in medical industry will understand what and explain what this is. Maybe they should speak to government about this booster dose. And obviously then change management in terms of sustaining that booster level that would have been achieved, to make sure that it's embraced, everyone is aligned to it, everyone can embrace it. Because there will be a lot of headway and headwind around these issues, yeah. The third and the last report point that I would like to reflect to that I think is quite open-minded. And it doesn't start with the commission. I mean, there may be other reports that may have made reference to it. Most of you will know that the Slabat Commission started to debate around this issue. They had a split decision, they had a majority view, they had a minority view. This whole issue of the review of the electoral system. When the high-level panel that was chaired by former President Mutlante, which I happen to also be privileged to be part of, looked at the legislative review of the effectiveness of legislation that was commissioned by the Speakers Forum. It also touched on this issue. It said, unless you change, in fact, it was even more emphatic and more decisive. It said, you can talk and do everything until the skies fall. If you don't change the electoral system, you're not going to go far in terms of the issue of the abuse, either the abuse of power or the comfort with the current power profile and mechanism of the oversight and the leadership, political leadership in the system. Obviously, this is something that needs to be given a lot of thought. This is something that needs to be given a lot of consideration, Once again, political will has got to be part of this. Visionary and mature leadership, not defensive leadership, has got to be part of this thing, because otherwise our country is imploding. Thought leadership and new thinking on progressive leadership accountability norms has got to be put into. We can't think that the current accountability norms of political leadership and state are perfect. The experiences that have gone through have proven that they're far from being perfect. So whether it's the electoral system or something else, but something needs to be done to make sure that that is improved and it is less susceptible to abuse. And lastly, there are things that may not necessarily be in the report of the commission. I've got two of them here, for instance. You notice that I haven't commented about how to deal with the issue of the psyche of a professional that has been schooled in public interest, that has been schooled in code of conduct, going and doing things that are contrary to that schooling. And above all, when they see things, they fail to report it. All right. I'm not going to talk about that here, but it's something that needs to be thought through and worked through. You may want to compare your notes here with the professional bodies. And I know SAICA has got a similar conference tomorrow in Sentin. They'll be dealing with this very same question. How do we deal with chartered accountants and support chartered accountants that want to uphold public interest and the code of conduct? Those principles are very noble and clear. There are a lot of gaps, I can tell you now, in terms of how our standards of accountability are defined and standards of auditing are defined. We'll talk about that as accountants tomorrow in Sentin. I'm not going to bore the lawyers and the policymakers in this room about that, but let's compare notes once that is done, and see how we can plug that gap. The other one is the issue of the capacity of the law enforcement agencies. I'm saying that because it is vitally important. And if one goes back to the tracking of some of the transactions, most people took courage and an effort to report things to law enforcement agencies, whether it's the FIC, whether it's the Reserve Bank, whether sometimes is the regulators like the RBA, Independent Regulatory Board of Auditors. But once they got to the law enforcement agencies, nothing happened. So capacity in that institution is of vital importance. I know the commission did not, for good reasons, the judge did explain that, made pronouncement on the law enforcement agencies. But this is one of the issues of capacity that needs to be considered. Whether they were captured or not, you will understand that, the chairman did explain why he could not get to the bottom of that. Yeah. So if I may then conclude, colleagues, with those few anecdotes, my thinking is that against these observations and recommendations, there's no doubt that there is a need for crystal clear legislative and policy positions that need to be worked on. Most of these issues don't have clear and legislative policy positions. And to the extent necessary, if some of these need to be made much more firmer at a constitutional level, I guess so be it. I think as lawyers, you'll understand better what will stand firm and stick if it's actually in the Constitution, and what can still go, even if it's not constitutionally enshrined. I guess as policymakers and legislatures, you'll be able to make that call. We know that the president, as Lawson has said, before the end of next month, will be making a submission to Parliament. It will be very interesting to observe, and we can hope that the tone of that report will address these serious entrenched issues that I've made reference here. The panelists are going to make reference to for the better part of today and tomorrow, so that we don't end up having a submission to Parliament that is simply just a formality and actually addresses nothing and none of what is actually burning issues of our country. Because what we need to address is the real iceberg of greed. I want to repeat that as my parting shot. And with that, I hope and wish fruitful deliberations as this gathering as we go forward today and tomorrow. Thanks for inviting me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the sobering. That's how I give it to you. I was going to call Refila to give it to you.
I don't have to declare to anyone.
Yes. No, absolutely. And even if you had to, I'm sure you would. So thank you very much for that sobering keynote address. And I mean, it's sad, it's sobering, but it also says to us that we can't just sit and throw our hands in the air. We do need to do something as civil society organizations around this issue. There's lots of work still to be done. So we have about 10 minutes to spare, and it's not common that we ask for questions in a keynote address, but we will have an exception just this once and just take one or two questions, if you don't mind, before we break for a break, before we take a break, because I think what you've given us a snapshot of the shop floor or the factory floor of what was happening in the commission, and I'm sure people are curious. So to the 90 people or so that are joining us virtually, and to the house here, I will allow just one or two questions, and we've got roving mics. I don't know if there are questions. Any questions for the keynote speaker, Mr. Nombembe? And Devi, if you can just take note of who is on the virtual platform that might have a question. We have a question here and there. Those are the two questions. If you can just introduce and your organization.
But thank you very much for that. Briefly, my name's Marianne Camera from the University of Cape Town. I was absolutely intrigued by your diagnosis that greed is the main cause of what you found in your many years at the Zondo Commission. And I'm just wondering, from a practical point of view, we're touching on issues of morality. You've mentioned laws, you've mentioned policies. In 2000, when we ran an expert panel survey, that's 22 years ago, under the Institute for Security Studies, we interviewed people who'd been at the National Anti-Corruption Summits, which were held around that time. And we asked them what they thought the main cause of corruption in South Africa was. And they said greed. So, how does one counter the narrative of radical economic transformation, of need? You're talking about selfish desire for power and wealth, but the majority of people who are affected by the negative impact of corruption are poor. So I just, this is where it's like being back there. We've got a diagnosis. We know that any plan rests on an accurate diagnosis. So in terms of that diagnosis, how do we move forward?
Sorry. So we'll just take all of the questions and then we'll take them all at once before we break. The mic should come here to the gentleman.
Hi, I'm Dennis Webster. I'm a journalist. Thank you so much. I just had a question on what you were touching on at the end of your talk about the possible legislative measures we can take, and if I could just ask you to speak a little bit further on that, if the Commission's ultimate findings are that laws have been may have been broken, and work should be done to further inquire that, I'd be interested to know, like, what your thoughts are on then what legislative loopholes the Commission's work may have identified, and I understand that you said that you're not a lawyer and that the Constitution is maybe but whether or not you would be willing to say what constitutional changes you're envisioning that may be able to sort of secure this a little bit, or entrench it further. Thank you.
Very much. David, do we have any questions from the virtual? If you can just read them out. Thank you.
Sure. I might be at a bit of a funny angle for the camera here. We have a question from the online chat room from Johan van Lochenberg. He asks, for the sake of many who naysay the concept of state capture, please give a definitive explanation of what it means.
Questions that we have for you.
Let me start with a simple one. In fact, I should have mentioned this from Johan van Lochenberg. The judge, one of his chapters, specifically wrote a chapter on his interpretation and analysis of what state capture means, is, and was for South Africa. So I don't have the specific number of the chapter, but it's part of the last part of the report. He spent a lot of time looking at that, and it's one of those reports that went up and down, and he finally put his final stamp of authority on what that meant from his standpoint, from his vantage point. I must say, I should have said this, one of the things about the work ethic of the chairman of the commission was everything that was in those 6,000 plus pages that went out had to go through his eyes. Because at the end of the day, he's the one that had to, I think they call it where the buck stops when it comes to the commission report. So if people can look at that report specifically, I should have mentioned that also, yeah. Yeah, because that was a big question that actually gave rise to the establishment of the commission. With regard to the specific legislative measures and thoughts on specific ones that should be there, they're really not defined, in my view. That's why work has got to happen to say, if we have got the issue of greed, can we legislate against that? If we've got the issue of the continuous breach of existing legislation, can we legislate against that or have a policy position around that? Whether it's just about empowering people, some of the things that tend not to happen, we tend to ignore them and leave them out in the legislation because we say legislation must talk about the big ticket items. And those obvious things are the ones that actually sink us in most instances. Because people that breach the law, they actually work on the unsaid things in the legislation and say, but this thing is not anywhere in law. So we've got to be very thorough and precise in actually how we craft our legislation to leave very limited room for different and misinterpretation and abuse of those legislations and policy positions. So I think that was part of my Dennis homework to this gathering, to say we still have a green field insofar as these issues are concerned, and therefore got an opportunity to really apply our minds, but we have the end state in mind, that this is what we want to curb. That's important. The impact to the poor, this is the most painful of this experience. Because you're right, it affects the poor. And maybe I can combine Marianne's comment with yours, Dennis. If I go through, for instance, if I just leave and I know the chairman in some of the reports, he does make specific possible changes to the legislation. I can't remember them off heart now. I was told that Debbie actually knows that report from cover to cover, word for word. Maybe Debbie can actually pinpoint those areas where the judge specifically mentions specific changes to the legislation, because they are there, some of them in the report, but they're not too many. They are fine few in between. I just want to go to the Mutlante report, the high-level panel. In his conclusion in that report, he highlights two things that need to be legislated. He says, one of the things that makes the National Development Plan not to succeed is the fact that there's no legislation that actually legislates against its rollout. It's supervision, it's implementation. It is happening voluntarily, there's commissioners, et cetera, but we look for legislation that actually makes that a serious matter for the state. None, zero, and it makes that recommendation. The second one is one that I mentioned around the electoral system. He's insistent in the high-level panel report that the issue of the electoral system has got to be given thorough legislative thinking and creativity and innovation. Because those are things that, even though they are few, including those that are mentioned in the state capture report, but they actually make the big difference in terms of the impact, which goes in favor of those that are most vulnerable, the poor, as Marian has mentioned. Yeah, I think we can talk for the whole day on these matters. Thanks. Yeah.
I think those who want to have follow-up questions can follow you, Mr. Nombembe, to your conference tomorrow in Sandton. You should send the location. Yes. Okay, for some of the questions that you referred your answers to the reports, Debbie has done a summary, actually. It's on the PARI website. I think it's www.pari.org.za/Zondo Commission. There's an 8-page summary of that, and the definition lifted out of the report on state capture is also there. So thank you very much for that. So now it is time for us to take our break. Before we go, though, the bathrooms are close to where the registration table is. If you didn't see them, they're there. We are going to break for 15 minutes. We'll come back here at 11. And also when we come back, I will remind you again in terms of your cell phone and your navigators to be on silent. And I do have a pet hate on silent phones, because sometimes when our phones are on silent, we actually think they're quiet. They still vibrate, and they make a noise vibrating. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, it's tea. Thank you.